At a presidential dinner last night, I reminded the guests that I was older than royal roads, and that therefore you have to treat me with a certain amount of deference and generosity and allow my eccentricities not to offend you. And at the dinner table as well was Dr. Catherine Atmansky, who has opened up this fascinating course at Royal Roads, a master's degree in global leadership. And it occurred to me as I listened to the discussion, and there was fascinating discussion, that that might well be a theme which I could explore with you at the few minutes that I have at my command. I always think it's a little presumptuous in these convocations when speakers attempt to tell you how to live your lives and exactly what to do as you move out into the merciless world of unemployment or employment, depending what faces you. And I'm more inclined, therefore, to rely on some thematic observations rather than to dictate the assumptions that might otherwise be conferred. I've spent a lot of my life, as Professor David Blatt indicated, engaged in international issues. That was a remarkably generous citation, and I profoundly appreciate it. And I have spent the last few days in New York dealing with the United Nations. And yesterday, at the Security Council of the United Nations, there was an intense debate on what happens to children in situations of armed conflict. And the Secretary General of the United Nations was saying that 2014 was the worst recorded year in the last couple of decades for children, and that the evisceration and annihilation of children as a result of the Syrias and the Libyas and the Afghanistans and the Iraqs and the Yemens was almost too heartbreaking to imagine, let alone to chronicle. And my mind went back to those 220 young girls, the Chibok girls as they're called, who were abducted by Boko Haram in northern Nigeria more than a year ago now. We'll never see them again. The desperate violations of their little personas is incomprehensible. They undoubtedly have been physically abused. They've been raped on a regular basis whenever the Boko Haram militants felt they were sexually entitled. They have suffered terribly as domestic servants. Many of them are doubtless pregnant and beside themselves how to handle the pregnancy. And yet the world never adequately responded. We all promised, and nothing happened. We managed to find drones which can pinpoint the assassination of al-Qaeda terrorists from Pakistan to Yemen, but we cannot summon the collective determination to rescue 200 young girls. And there's something vastly distorted in the priorities of humankind that's the case. While I was at the United Nations just these last couple of weeks, news emerged which electrified Europe that in the middle of 2014, approximately 1 year ago, a number of little boys aged 8 and 9 were sexually abused and sodomized by French troops who were actually peacekeeping in the Central African Republic. And the knowledge of what had happened to those little boys was gathered by the UN, and no one said anything for an entire year. And it emerged that the highest levels of officialdom in the United Nations, there had been damage control, there had been secrecy, there had been a conspiratorial network to suppress the information of what was happening to these children. And I constantly think to myself, what kind of leadership do we have in so many parts of the world? How is it not possible that there are institutional arrangements, there isn't a greater energy to confront the most diabolical and terrifying dimensions of human depravity? And when I think of what happened to those little boys and what happens to the Chibok girls in Nigeria, I think of the broader issue of sexual violence, which has become a kind of epidemic around the world. It's not only in conflict. It's intimate partner violence, it's marital rape, it's gang rape, it's what happens outside of conflict. You remember the terrible rape and murder of the young woman on the bus in Delhi in December 2012, and the way in which that pattern was repeated in a number of countries like South Africa. It's heartbreaking, it's incomprehensible. It's rooted, as David indicated in the introduction, in gender inequality. And he's right. There is no struggle on the planet more important than the struggle for gender equality. You cannot marginalize 50% of the world's population. And ever expect to achieve social justice. It won't happen. And the litany, the catalog of discrimination and stigma and violence visited on women in the world, whether it's international sex trafficking or female genital mutilation, or the absence of land rights, or the absence of inheritance rights, or the absence of political representation, taken together, it's a monstrous reality which we must overcome. And I thought while I was at the United Nations that this September at the UN, all of the countries of the world will gather to consecrate what they call the Sustainable Development Goals, goals that will govern public policy in most countries for the next 15 years. And two of those goals are particularly important. One of them is the elimination of poverty and hunger. And what we have learned as we direct our views to those goals is that the very rich countries of the Western world are not anywhere near reaching the target which was decided on in 1970 of finding 0.7% of gross domestic product to assign to foreign aid. As a matter of fact, Canada has dropped almost to the bottom of the numbers of Western countries in the percentage of aid. It's painful to think that our country, my country, your country, is so delinquent in this measure. And the other side, of course, is a question of what we do about climate change, which will be central to the discussions in September. I'm one of those people who believes that by the year 2050, I teach this stuff, so I have to read it all the time, we're going to have an apocalyptic event which will eclipse everything from the tsunami to what happened in New Orleans, even in terms of the measurable human impact to what happened in Haiti. And there doesn't seem to be a readiness to recognize that we're fighting for the survival of the planet, that our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are put at enormous risk for survival. And just a couple of weeks ago, the G7 nations got together and congratulated themselves. It was kind of an orgy of self-congratulation as they said by 2100, we will no longer be carbon-dependent economies. But what a load of rhetorical claptrap. There were no targets. There was nothing by way of compliance. There were no punitive dimensions if you didn't comply. It was just a series of aspirational, voluntary assertions, which you know and I know never reach implementation. And necessarily, before I bring these remarks to an end, I want to mention HIV and AIDS, which is a pandemic by no means over, despite the constant talk of the end of AIDS. We still have 20 million people living with the virus to whom we have to get treatment. And they're fighting desperately to survive through the communities and on the grassroots of Africa. And right at this moment in time, the major international financial donors and the major international countries are drawing back, and the funds are drying up. And I cannot convey to you the human consequences on the ground as people struggle to survive. It's like a vast Ebola network, except it isn't 10,000 who die, which is an atrocity. It's over 1.5 million who are still dying every year. And the effort must continue to be made in the face of these financial restraints which are imposed on those who need the money most. May I diverge slightly to say we always have money to bail out the banks, and we always have money for corporate bonuses, and we always have money to fight wars, but we never have sufficient funds to help global public health. And that's what has to be overcome. The absence of leadership, what a course global leadership could be. The absence of leadership on so many fronts is obviously disheartening. But it's disheartening in our country as well. This is the last honorary degree I ever intend to accept. I don't expect to have them further offered, so it's an easy statement to make. But I saved the best for the last, you will agree. And I want to I want to say to you that one of the things which is inexplicable to me as a Canadian is the government's response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You know, I was an honorary witness in Vancouver at that commission, and sitting in the audience and listening to the testimony of men and women who'd been through the residential schools, I was embarrassed, I was mortified to be a Canadian. The terrible violations and sexual violence against tiny young girls. The man who took the platform with his support group and looked at the commissioners and said, I was 11 years old when they pulled my pants down, and I didn't understand what was happening. And I thought, in Canada, in my country, and then finally we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission which looks at the residential schools, which draws necessary attention to the more than 1,000 missing and murdered Aboriginal women. And when they produce the report, there isn't a peep from the government. The Prime Minister sits in virtual silence. I don't understand it. These aren't issues which require ideological positions. We're talking about First Nations. These are issues which should unite a Canadian response. And I am completely bewildered by the failure to respond urgently and effectively. And you're going to have to forgive me for this, but I'm just too damned old, I have to say it. I regard it as racism, pure and explicit, unadorned, no question. And I'm therefore proud to be speaking from traditional Aboriginal lands, so proud to be a part of Royal Roads, extremely gratified and honored by the honorary degree. And although I have imposed on you unduly around time, I want to thank you more than I can possibly summon. Thanks.